Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2021 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of the pamphlet How to Overthrow the Illuminati by Will, Chino, Sodad, and Mamos. I'm not sure when this is dated. I first saw this pamphlet probably about 10 years ago, so maybe early 2010s. As somebody who personally, back in the 2000s, when Marxism seemed like a very far off, unattainable thing to work on a project like this, well prior to YouTube and things like that, I crossed paths with this whole conspiracy and Illuminati movement and got somewhat involved in that. There wasn't a hell of a lot else to do, unfortunately, at least in my neck of the woods. And one of the reasons that I come down so hard on the idea of trying to work with right populists is, it's just the amount of just sheer confusion there. And this pamphlet, I think, is a decent attempt at correcting some of the thinking that you find there about conspiracies, the New World Order, the Illuminati, and things like that, and trying to bring people around to more of a socialist perspective on the actual power structures that people are, to some extent, attempting to critique when they try to talk about the Illuminati and things like that. I personally, tried to do things in that vein and sort of using that language at the time. And I realized there's just kind of only so far that you can get with that, and not very far is the answer. That's why I really don't endorse that approach today. And I think that efforts like this to basically really engage with what is it that people who talk about, conspiracies and the Illuminati and things like that, what are they talking about, and then trying to demystify it and put it in Marxist terms, I applaud that. So today we're going to read that and then have a discussion of it. Okay, so again, this is an audiobook of How to Overthrow the Illuminati by Will, Chino, Sodad, and Mamos. You can reach them at overthrowingilluminati.wordpress.com or overthrowingilluminati@gmail.com. So we begin with a quote. "The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living." Karl Marx, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, 1852. Introduction. Everyone talks about the Illuminati. You may have heard Jay-Z and Beyonce are members of the Illuminati and channel demons when they perform. You may have heard Obama is a member of the Illuminati and plans to implant microchips in all U.S. citizens to prepare for martial law. You may have heard the dollar bill contains secret symbols which reveal that the U.S. has been controlled by the Illuminati for hundreds of years. Illuminati theory helps oppressed people to explain our experiences in the hood. Society throws horrible stuff in our faces. Our family members get locked up for bullshit. Our friends kill each other over beefs, money, or turf. Our future is full of dead-end jobs that don't pay shit. We struggle to pay bills while others live in luxury. On TV, we see people all over the world dying in poverty, even though we live in the most materially abundant society in history. Most people act like none of these terrible things are happening. So why does this occur? We start looking for answers, and Illuminati theory provides one. We believe Illuminati theory is wrong, and we wrote this pamphlet to offer a different answer. We wrote this pamphlet because we know people who think about the Illuminati usually want to stop oppression and exploitation. They're some of the smartest people in the hood today. 40 years ago, Illuminati theorists would have been in the Black Panther Party. Today, most of them sit around and talk endlessly about conspiracies. That is a waste of talent. The world is in a deep crisis, and big protests, rebellions, and revolutions are happening. In Egypt, South Africa, Turkey, and even in the US, these movements are already taking place. People who say we can't do anything because no one else is fighting are simply refusing to join the fight themselves. With the right tools, we can participate in these actions and make history with millions of others. This pamphlet is a tool to help you understand the world around you. It offers a brief history of Illuminati theory, who invented it, when, and where. It shows how Illuminati theory became popular in the hood after the defeat of the movements of the 1970s. It reveals that Illuminati theory is unable to explain how society works or provide solutions for how to end oppression and exploitation. It offers an alternative explanation of why exploitation and oppression exists and what we can do to change it. But first, we have to unearth the origin of Illuminati theory itself. Part 1. Where Illuminati theory came from. Almost every Illuminati theory is made up of a few main pieces, like the different parts of an urban legend. The pieces can be put together in different combinations, or one piece can be emphasized more than another. But these always combine to tell more or less the same story. You may have heard these different pieces mentioned: the Illuminati, the Masons, Satanists, the Bilderbergs, or the bankers. Each of these pieces of Illuminati theory arose at different times in history. In most cases, they were developed by rich and powerful people who were being kicked out of power by mass movements. The first piece is the Bavarian Illuminati. This is based on a real group called the Order of Illuminists. The Illuminists were founded in May 1776 in Bavaria, part of present-day Germany, but Germany as we know it didn't exist at that time. The leader of the Illuminists, a Bavarian professor of religious law named Adam Weishaupt, wanted to free the world, quote, from all established religious and political authority. His order aimed to get rid of the kings and the churches that had ruled Europe since the Middle Ages and make room for new forms of commerce, science, and democratic government that were struggling to emerge at the time. The Illuminists modeled themselves partly on the Jesuits, an order of Catholic priests, and partly on the Freemasons. They infiltrated Masonic lodges in order to gain influence in society and pursue their goals. To understand any group or movement, you have to understand the context it emerged from. The time period when the Illuminists appeared was called the Enlightenment. It was a century of ongoing radical change in Europe, stretching from the 1600s to the late 1700s. During the Enlightenment, the old social system that people had lived in for centuries, dominated by kings and priests on top, with peasants at the bottom, began to break down. A class of rich merchants arose in Europe, trading with far-flung parts of the globe. New technologies developed, and with them, new kinds of skilled workers. These new classes started to wield more power than the kings and queens who were supposed to be on top, according to law and tradition. The American Revolution demonstrated the power of these classes to the whole world when they broke free from the British Crown. As the social world began to change, people began to think differently. Before the Enlightenment, most people believed that the physical world and the social order were determined by God's divine law. As the Enlightenment set in, experimenters like Isaac Newton and philosophers like Hobbes and Rousseau developed modern science and politics. People started to believe that the physical world was shaped by natural laws, like the law of gravity, that could be discovered by investigation. They described how governments could be organized without kings through a social contract among citizens. Soon, hundreds of small groups of thinkers and activists caught the spirit of the Enlightenment. The Order of Illuminists was just one such group, along others like the Rosicrucians and the Italian Carbonari. During the 1780s, the Illuminists grew to about 2,500 members in Central Europe, but they weren't very successful at overturning the medieval order and soon began facing repression from authorities. They disbanded around 1787. Like so many other groups of its kind, the Illuminists failed to bring about revolutionary changes, but revolutionary change happened without them. In the decade after the collapse of the Order of Illuminists, massive protests rocked France, culminating in the French Revolution. Rebellions by angry peasants and urban workers overturned the feudal order that had existed for centuries and sent shockwaves across Europe. Slaves in the French colony of Haiti launched their own revolution, demanding the same freedoms French citizens were winning on the streets of Paris. In France, the aristocrats were kicked out of their palaces and systematically killed so that no king could ever claim the throne again. Churches were burned to the ground and Catholic priests driven from positions of power. A parliamentary system was established with elections, representatives, and a legislature. It was the first time anything like it had happened in history. Not everyone celebrated the changes sweeping through Europe, however. People whose social status depended on the old aristocracy and the church tended to resist the changes. Some of them wrote books, and this is how the first Illuminati conspiracy theories were created. In 1798, an English scientist and inventor named John Robinson wrote proofs of a conspiracy against all the religions and governments of Europe, carried on in the secret meetings of Freemasons, Illuminati, and reading societies. Quick comment, you gotta love those old school book titles that are like take up the entire cover. Anyway, in 1803, Jesuit priest Abbé Augustin Barruel wrote memoirs illustrating the history of Jacobinism. Both authors disliked the French Revolution, and so they blamed it on a small group of conspirators, the quote, Illuminati. Robinson and Barruel argued that the Order of Illuminists didn't really disband in 1787, but only went underground. They claimed that this Illuminati had secretly plotted and carried out the French Revolution and were still hiding in Masonic lodges, planning to overthrow governments in Europe and America. Robinson and Barruel disliked revolution, and they didn't think it was possible for millions of people to mobilize together and change the conditions of their lives. To them, ordinary people weren't organized or smart enough to pull it off. They needed to be guided like sheep by an elite group. In this way, Robinson and Barruel's original Illuminati theory was a kind of conservative myth used to make sense of a social reality its authors found confusing and scary. Today's Illuminati theory follows the same pattern. Even poor people who draw on Illuminati theory, who otherwise might sympathize with protest movements, often view movements as secret ploys by the Illuminati or some similar group to cause trouble. And the Freemasons. Robinson and Barruel's original Illuminati theory and Illuminati theory today talks a lot about the Masons. The original order of Illuminists established itself in Freemasonry groups, which are called lodges. But Freemasonry had emerged a few hundred years earlier. Originally, Freemasonry was just what it sounded like, a group of people who worked with masonry and stone to build structures. Starting in the 1300s, skilled workers such as masons, weavers, and blacksmiths began to organize in groups called guilds. Guilds received permission to carry out their trade in a given town and policed who could do their line of work. They were highly exclusive, and they invented rituals and symbolism to distinguish themselves from everybody else. As capitalism developed, the guilds slowly broke down. New technologies made their outdated tools and skills irrelevant, and most of them disappeared. But the Masonic lodges were different. In the 1700s, Masonic lodges began recruiting rich or influential people in order to maintain their funds and high social status. They soon lost their association with masonry work and turned into a social club. Masonic lodges provided a venue for radical organizing as the Enlightenment set in. The emerging class of rich merchants and intellectuals, what we would call the emerging capitalist class, gathered in Masonic lodges, discussed the changes taking place in society, and planned activist actions. Many famous revolutionaries developed their radical ideas while they were Freemasons. Because of this association with Enlightenment radicalism, people who opposed revolution tended to view Freemasons as the enemy. This is a common pattern. The elite always think revolutions are planned and directed by a small group of enlightened people instead of by masses of people themselves. In reality, Masonic lodges are elaborate social clubs for people who want to feel elite. In some places, Masonic lodges have provided a place for intellectuals to discuss how to change society, but they're usually pretty boring. If you go into a Masonic temple today, you'll see groups of small business owners talking about how to plant trees on Main Street, not a secret group plotting to rule the world. Nevertheless, their association with the original Bavarian Order of Illuminists has meant that they're always included in Illuminati theory. The Bavarian Illuminati and its association with Freemasonry is the first piece of the Illuminati theory we hear today. But there are two other important pieces to most Illuminati theories: anti-Semitism and the Antichrist. So comment there. That's the end of the first section on Freemasonry before we get into anti-Semitism. I just want to elaborate on that. So they're correct that Masonic lodges are elaborate social clubs for people who want to feel elite. I would just add to that, I mean, there actually is a great deal of reality to that elitism, both among the attitudes of people that you will find in those places, and when they talk about the small business owners, doing a very innocuous thing like, how to plant trees on Main Street. It's not all entirely that innocuous, at least as far as we live now in the system that the capitalists have set up, and it's oppressive to most of us. So yeah, these have been old boy networks for quite some time of small business owners and other sort of local VIPs to particular areas where they coordinate with other people who they do favors for and who do favors for them. And, it's one thing to touch on, I think, the history of how the existing sort of secrecy and the secret society, special handshake and password and all that stuff that was built into Freemasonry from the 1300s got sort of hijacked by capitalists in the 1700s and was used as a, place, because it was already secret, for, making some plans of, hey, what if we sort of took over society? But that all led to the development of capitalism, not socialism or anything like that. So it's capitalism. And then even on in the 1800s and the 1900s, it's like, who are the Freemason? Well, the lodge is like those guys who owns this thing and they own that thing. In terms of the class character of Freemasonic membership, I think you'll find it's more petty bourgeois and bourgeois people who own things, not the working class, by and large. So anyway, but to the extent that it is relevant at all, and you can find Masonic imagery in all kinds of places. So it's an interesting thing. It's like kind of a big rabbit hole that you can go down. I think that they have reduced it a little bit too far in this pamphlet. There is more juice there. It's a strange and interesting and mysterious history, but by that very nature, it also allows people to peddle some real bullshit about it as well and get people somewhat overly interested in it. Although, again, it has played a role in the emergence of capitalism and its maintenance to some extent, both at a grand level and at a more local level. That's not to take away from what they have said otherwise in the pamphlet. But Freemasonry is one of those very odd subjects that gets a lot of defense from a lot of different corners. But as far as people who were, for example, against the French Revolution, these are monarchists, basically. When we talk about reactionaries, that's about as deep a reactionary view as you can have. A lot of times people who will attack Freemasonry are also very religious, because these revolutions and in the Enlightenment, some of the power of the church was broken. And so, again, deeply, deeply reactionary. Although from a socialist perspective, that's also not an endorsement of Freemasonry, other than they were a little more progressive than, I guess, the monarchy. But we still have to fight the capitalist order that they instituted. So, or that capitalists within them using Freemasonry as a protective cloak, organized. It's a little murky. That's the case when you're talking about a secret society. But anyway, let's go on to section 2. And if you have questions, put them in the comments. All right, section 2, anti-Semitism. Distrust, prejudice, and hatred towards Jews arose in Europe hundreds of years ago. Europe was ruled by kingdoms allied with the Catholic Church after the collapse of the Roman Empire. Jews were banned from playing a major role in the economy or gaining political power. Over time, different Jewish communities found ways to survive at the edges of society, doing things that mainstream society looked down upon, like lending money. Soon, Jews as a whole became associated with this profession. At first, this profession wasn't very powerful, but as capitalism developed, money lending or credit became more important. As capitalism developed, millions of people were driven off the land and forced to work for poverty wages in the new factories of industrial Europe. Because Jews were already identified with money and credit, different groups began to view Jews as a symbol of capitalism itself. Many European workers believed Jews used their role as financiers to gain power and exploit people. Jews also provided a convenient scapegoat for the petty bourgeoisie, small business owners trying to become big-time factory owners. This class resented the debts they had to take out in order to expand their businesses. They viewed financiers as an obstacle to, quote, fair competition. In the early 20th century, Jewish communities regularly suffered attacks by mobs of workers and petty bourgeois business owners. Especially in Eastern Europe and Russia, pogroms, or lynch mobs against Jewish neighborhoods, were a common occurrence. Anti-Semitism united poor workers with small business owners, despite their opposed interests. The poor workers were angry about their treatment under capitalism, but they saw Jews as a bigger enemy than their exploiting factory bosses. The small business owners worked to become the big-time exploiters of the poor workers, and they felt Jews stood in the way of those goals. These two classes were fundamentally opposed to each other, the factory owners and the workers, but they temporarily joined together in a populist movement because of their mutual, misguided anti-Semitism. Populist movements join poor people with the petty bourgeoisie against imagined elite enemies. They speak in the name of the, quote, common man, but they're guided by middle-class elements, and they screw over poor and working participants in the end. Quick comment, we would also call these class collaborationist because they're a collaboration between classes, whereas we advocate for class struggle between classes. Continuing. Contemporary examples of populism include the Tea Party, some parts of Occupy Wall Street, and the Nation of Islam. Comment, this was written before MAGA, but absolutely MAGA also, I would add. Also the Libertarian Party, which is just for totally deregulated free trade, often uses populist rhetoric trying to appeal to working people, which libertarianism completely would fuck over. Parts of the Green Party also do this. Parts of the Green Party which have been reluctant to actually embrace socialism tend to go for more of a populist approach. Also, you see podcasters in the left, people like Kyle Kulinski, who's a social democrat, will often talk about populism. Jimmy Dore also talks about populism and makes populist appeals. But ultimately, we want to get away from this kind of class collaborationism because wind up looking like an asshole. Anyway, continuing. Illuminati theories are often populist in character. Many populist theories draw on anti-Semitism to identify an evil elite that runs the world. Many Illuminati theories make use of a document from the early 1900s called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The protocols claimed to be a secret document written by Jews about their plans to take over the world. In fact, they were written sometime between 1897 and 1903, most likely by members of the Russian secret police. At the time, Russian nationalists were trying to prevent the breakout of a Russian revolution against the Emperor of Russia, known as the Tsar. Most nationalists were strongly anti-Semitic. They viewed the entire mass movement to overthrow the Tsar as a Jewish conspiracy. The protocols were written to help fuel the movement against Jews in order, they thought, to prevent the revolution. Comment there, we do a lot of audiobooks of the writings of Lenin from this time, the early 1900s, late 1890s. The first Russian Revolution was in 1905. So exactly this time, the rule of the Tsar was breaking down. He had reactionary supporters known as the Black Hundreds. We've covered the Black Hundreds several times on the channel, Lenin writing about them, and we would compare them maybe to some of the more militant defenders of the capitalist order in 2021 America. You look at some of these alt-right militias and people like the Boogaloos who turn out with weapons in favor of reopening during a pandemic, stuff like that. I mean, fascism basically, if this sounds like some of the fascist appeals that the Nazi Party made, yeah, you're correct. Also in Italy, fascist Italy, when fascism arose there, it was in the wake of a failed socialist revolution, and the fascists said, no more class struggle, we got to do class collaboration, come together for the good of the nation, etc., etc. These are reactionary movements trying to hold on to the order of the past. And they're populist in nature, and they're usually pretty desperate. I mean, this is what capitalism does when it's desperate to hang on to things, is they break out the fascists, just like they're doing in the US now. They've been keeping them on ice for a little while, but they're letting them run wild in the streets today. And this is why. The US is increasingly unstable economically, and they want to beat back anybody who is trying to stir up class struggle. That's really what this is about avoiding. Remember, people who promote these theories, they're basically against the idea that the masses of people can rise up and determine the conditions of our own lives. In the case of Marxism, socialism, we believe that the proletariat, people who don't own anything, they just work to live. In other words, you don't have any capital stocks or anything, you don't own an apartment building to get money from, you have to work to live. Well, that the proletariat is this class that capitalism creates by the nature of the way the capitalists make you work, and that basically the proletariat needs to take control of society because we're the class that capitalism has created, and we need to determine the conditions of our own life. People who promote this kind of stuff, They don't really like that idea. So anyway, we do. Continuing, most of the Protocols was crudely copied from two other books. Dialogue in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu, written by Maurice Joly in 1864, and Biarritz, a German novel written in 1868 by Hermann Godesche. Despite being exposed as a fake, the document became widely read in Russia and Europe, and eventually the US too. Because of this, Illuminati theories regularly make mention of Jewish banking groups like the Rothschilds and the Bilderbergs, and portray Jews as a secret group intent on world domination. This is the second major piece of the Illuminati theory. The third is the Antichrist. And so that's the end of section 2. Before we get into the third piece, the Antichrist, all the Christian satanic stuff, mentioning the Rothschilds and the Bilderbergs. Yeah, so I mean, finance capital from a Marxist perspective, I mean, we're opposed to all forms of capitalist activity. The problem is that when you look at these like populist right-wing movements, like something like an Alex Jones, so they talk about the Rothschilds and the Bilderbergs, but they never really talk about the system. And basically this serves the purpose of trying to take what is basically the problem with the overall system, which we need to change. Capitalism can't last forever. We have to bring it down and replace it with socialism. That's basically the Marxist view. Is it gives them a scapegoat for the entire system to just say, oh, well, it's the Rothschilds. They have these evil intentions. Or it's the Bilderbergs. It's not that like the Rothschild family or the Bilderbergs being financial capitalists are like something that socialists would support. The problem is when populists come along and start to distort, people from getting a systemic understanding of what's actually going on, and they just try to like pin it on these scapegoats. That's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to promote actual analysis of historical development, not just like idiotic scapegoating, which really just benefits people who are trying to be your boss and to exploit you. So anyway, end of section 2 comments. Let's go to the third piece, the Antichrist. Many Illuminati theorists also talk about the end of days and the mark of the beast. These terms come from a religious movement called Protestant millenarianism, which arose in the mid-1800s. Millenarian movements believe that the end of the world is coming and try to get ready for it. So comment, millenarian means people who believe in the millennium. I think they're going to elaborate on that. Millenarians in the 1800s developed a complex timeline describing the second coming of Christ with a sequence of important signs. One of the signs was the coming of the, quote, Antichrist. In the Bible, the Antichrist is sometimes described as a single person and sometimes as many individuals or groups. This, quote, Antichrist is supposed to gain dictatorial power over the world just before Christ's return. Today, many U.S. evangelical Christians are constantly looking for signs that the Antichrist is appearing. Quick comment on that. In the U.S. South, little Bible tracts and pamphlets talking about exactly that, which would be like funny if it wasn't so sad and if these people had no political power. They're just everywhere. And there was, I don't know if it was the 80s or the early 90s, but a group of kind of pranksters and satirists started to make fun of this, and they created kind of an performance art social project called the Church of the Subgenius, which basically was just like a massive parody of all this stuff. Very surreal, subversive, kind of weird stuff. But if you're into kind of weird stuff and haven't heard of that, that's exactly what they satirize. And they get together every year to await for the in their religion, it's the aliens are going to come down and like save everybody. It is a joke though, but it's directly based on this kind of stuff because it's just batshit if you read through it. It's just totally fucking just off the wall. Continuing, in the early 20th century, World War I, the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, and World War II gave these evangelicals many signs that the end was drawing near. Based on their interpretation of the Bible, evangelicals looked for signs of growing government power and individuals with cult-like status that might be the Antichrist. In the 1920s, U.S. evangelical leader Gerald Winrod claimed that Mussolini, the Italian fascist leader, was actually the Antichrist. He said that the League of Nations, which was set up at the end of World War I and the predecessor of the United Nations, was a sign of his growing world power. The, quote, end of days predictions continued for years afterwards. In the 1950s, some evangelicals predicted that a new invention called the computer was actually the Antichrist. In the 1970s, others argued that the microchip, or laser barcodes, were this mark of the beast, destined to brand individuals in the Antichrist's name. During Obama's election, many people thought he was the Antichrist. The figure of the Antichrist and the end of days has been a main piece of many Illuminati theories since the 1920s. The story works like a game of bingo. Believers have a list of signs of the end of the world, and they sit around waiting for them to appear. Every popular political figure, like Obama, can be seen as the Antichrist. Every big political organization, like the UN, can be seen as the Antichrist's, growing power. Of course, this involves a total misunderstanding of what's happening, but that never stopped them before. Every development in information technology, like implanted microchips, can be seen as this mark of the beast. Theories like these don't accurately describe reality. Instead, they get people to find evidence for a theory they already want to believe. This gets into confirmation bias or cherry-picking evidence because they just look at it through that selective lens. The next section, these three pieces combined equal Illuminati theory as we know it. All the pieces we've talked about so far were combined in the 1920s, a time of great unrest. Before and after World War I, there were huge working class rebellions against capitalism. Massive workers' movements with millions of members rocked Germany, Italy, France, England, and even the US. Workers finally toppled the Tsar in the Russian Revolution of 1917, and they tried to establish a communist society. To many people, it seemed like a wave of socialist revolution would overturn capitalism, just as capitalism had overturned feudalism a century before. And just like before, those who depended on the dominant order opposed the revolutionary movement. They felt the need to explain the growing unrest, which they disliked and couldn't understand. Imagine not being able to understand why people don't like capitalism. But anyway, just like the kings and queens in the French Revolution who couldn't explain the uprisings against them, the modern capitalists turned to Illuminati theories. They didn't think workers were smart enough to actually change the world. In 1926, Nesta Webster, an English aristocrat, published Secret Societies and Subversive Movements, The Need for Fascism in Great Britain. Lady Queenborough, also known as Edith Starr Miller, the daughter of a U.S. industrial capitalist, published Occult Theocracy in 1933. Both writers argued that the revolutionary fervor sweeping the globe was caused by a secret conspiracy. Both combined the old Illuminati theory with new elements. Webster and Queenborough hyped up the Illuminati more than before. Now, the Illuminati were said to be descendants of the ancient Knights Templar, and every secret society that ever existed was supposedly an Illuminati front group. They also linked Jewish financiers to the Illuminati conspiracy. The Illuminati, they said, were paid by a secret group of Jewish bankers in their quest for world domination. Webster and Queenborough's conspiracy theories were preached in the U.S. by Gerald Winrod, the same Winrod described above, who was on the lookout for the Antichrist. Winrod wrote a pamphlet in 1935 called Adam Weishaupt, A Human Devil, which drew on Webster and Queenborough's work. He argued that communism itself was a Jewish conspiracy, and that the Illuminati conspiracy heralded the coming of the Antichrist. Webster, Queenborough, and Winrod brought together the three pieces of Illuminati theory under one big umbrella. Their writings established the main core common to the Illuminati theories we hear today. The Illuminati are a secret society financed by a Jewish banking syndicate, which goes way back to ancient religious societies and which aims to rule the world. In some cases, the Illuminati are portrayed as followers of Satan, or the Antichrist, aiming to bring about his rule on earth. Almost every Illuminati theory today builds off of this core theory. Originally, Illuminati theories were used by elites to try to explain and stop movements. But if these theories were first developed by elites and other conservative forces, how did they end up being used by poor and oppressed people in the hood. That's the end of Section 1. Now on to Section 2. How Illuminati theory came to the hood. Elites invented Illuminati theory to explain challenges to their power, and today poor and working class people in the hood use it to explain our own oppression. We live in a society that blames individuals for failing to succeed, but people in the hood aren't stupid. We know we aren't to blame, and that there are outside forces preventing us from living with dignity. For this reason, conspiracy theories and urban legends have been a common feature of oppressed communities in the U.S., especially black communities, for decades. In black neighborhoods, people say AIDS was invented by the government to kill off black people. People say the government has secret plans to establish martial law and open concentration camps. They say Church's Fried Chicken is secretly owned by the Klan, which uses it to destroy black people's health. These small conspiracy theories and urban legends have floated around black communities for years. It was only a matter of time until the huge conspiracy theories, invented in the 1920s, put them together in one big Illuminati theory. Without meaning to, the black liberation movement helped this to happen. Illuminati theory came to the hood after the defeat of the black liberation movement of the 1970s. Conspiracy theories during Black Power and after it. At the height of the rebellions of the 1960s, millions of black people were rebelling against U.S. capitalism. The revolts were huge. In the summers between 1965 and 1968, every major city in the country experienced a rebellion. People looted goods and distributed them for free. They raided National Guard armories and battled the police in the streets. As the struggle developed, millions of people began to question why black people experienced oppression and exploitation, and who the enemies were. Black communists like the Panthers identified the enemy as white supremacist capitalism and aimed to unite workers of all races against this system. Others, like Ron Karenga, the inventor of Kwanzaa, fell back on wrong explanations, similar to Illuminati theory. They saw black people as a united group, regardless of whether they were rich or poor, and they thought that all black people were in a war against all white people. The Nation of Islam invented a myth of black superiority. It taught its followers that whites were created thousands of years ago by a black scientist named Yaqub in a lab accident. Quick comment, I did not know that. That's up there with Scientology. Okay. Now, with the help of the NOI, blacks were out to regain their rightful place as the superior race on Earth. This story had no basis in science or history, but it provided one explanation for black oppression and who the enemy was. Another part of the Black Power movement turned to anti-Semitism. Many black people saw small business owners exploiting black customers, and banks refusing to loan to blacks, and some of the people were Jews. In Black Art, the most famous poem of the Black Arts movement, Amiri Baraka wrote that blacks needed, quote, dagger poems in the slimy bellies of the owner Jews, unquote. Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam also embraced anti-Semitic rhetoric at this time. These black artists and activists mistook the immediate appearance of their oppression for the whole thing. Yes, black people were exploited by petty bourgeois business owners and bankers. Yes, many of these folks, but not all of them, were Jewish. But they exploited black people because they were business owners, not because of their religion. Behind these individuals lay a much bigger global capitalist system which exploited black people too. But black militants couldn't put their finger on this, so instead they blamed the bankers and small shop owners who were in front of their faces. Like in the 1800s, anti-Semitism in the 1960s served as a populist myth, which hid class differences within the black community. Poor and working class blacks could have united and collaborated with other poor people to oppose the ruling class. They could have fought the black business owners, who later became police chiefs and mayors. Instead, they united with black business owners and politicians against a made-up Jew enemy. By the 1970s, the black liberation movement had been mostly defeated. The rebellions had been put down with armed force, and the revolutionaries were dead or imprisoned. U.S. capitalism adopted reforms to take the steam out of the movement. Black mayors were elected in cities across the U.S. New careers opened up for black professionals. There had always been black business owners and middle-class people, but legal segregation and white mob violence kept them living with and servicing the black working class. Now many of the legal and social barriers holding down the black bourgeoisie, capitalists, and middle class were removed. They quickly rose socially and economically and left the black poor behind. Like all capitalists, black capitalists sought profits over people, black or otherwise. Like all politicians, black politicians looked over their own interests, and their constituencies came second. The black mayors elected in the 1970s soon directed the crackdowns on the black movement itself. In Philadelphia, black mayor Wilson Goode oversaw the bombing of the MOVE organization, a black radical group, in 1985. The actions of the black capitalists and politicians confused the black movement because they thought they had been fighting alongside the black business owners, capitalists, and politicians. Black revolutionaries like Fred Hampton, who might have opposed these developments, were imprisoned or killed off. As a result, younger generations weren't exposed to the idea of class war between black workers and the black and white ruling class. Other black revolutionaries helped black politicians run for office, or became academics, and stopped talking about revolution. Internationally, the national liberation movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America came to an end. The theories of revolution coming from these struggles lost popularity. All this left a political void in poor and working class black communities. Black people had made it into positions of political and economic power, but racist oppression and exploitation continued for poor and working class black people. How could one explain this reality? Illuminati theory flowed in to fill this gap. It was similar to other conspiracy theories that had been used before. It said that the black elite had made it because they were part of a secret group of rulers, or they had cut a deal with the devil. It said that poor and working class black people were still oppressed because these rulers were super powerful, and the trend deepened in the 1990s. Illuminati theory in the, quote, New World Order. Illuminati theory resurged all over the US in the early 1990s. Before Russia collapsed and the Cold War ended, most people felt big events could be explained by the conflict between US capitalism and Russian state socialism. Every national liberation struggle in the Third World had to pick between these two sides. Comment, there was also a non-aligned movement, but basically, yeah. But everything changed with the end of the Cold War and the growth of globalization. What was globalization? Capital going global with the reduced resistance of, well, there was no more Soviet Union. Also, information technology, like the internet, was starting to really take off, enabling more globalization of different operations. In 1990, George Bush Sr. called the fall of Russia and victory of the US, quote, a new world order. This phrase was adopted by a variety of conspiracy theorists as an umbrella term to link conspiracy theories together. Comment, many of these were the so-called paleocons, like really old school conservatives, very deeply reactionary people who just really did not have a modern mindset in any way. Continuing, conspiracy theorists began to publish super conspiracy theories, which tied every existing conspiracy and urban legend to the Illuminati storyline. Some of these conspiracies involved UFOs, Satanists, or secret government plots to colonize space. The most famous super conspiracy book is Behold a Pale Horse, written by William Cooper in 1991. Behold a Pale Horse brings together a huge range of different conspiracy theories in one big web, including the Illuminati, Jewish bankers, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, UFOs, and more. Comment, you could also definitely look at somebody like David Icke, and Alex Jones wrote a ton of books as well doing similar types of things. David Icke is the lizard people guy. Many of these theories were used by poor and working class whites. Whites were confused and angry about the impoverishment they experienced with factory closings due to globalization and the growing status of non-whites in U.S. society. They said the government was coming with silent black helicopters to take away their guns. They said the government was planning to unleash murderous black gangs on the population. Quick comment, go watch the movie Red Dawn from 1984 if you want like a really boring it's the most boring action movie I've ever seen in my life, but it is exactly this type of paranoid theory. In fact, some socialists should like remake that movie, but like really play it up for fun. I think that would be hugely entertaining. Anyway, I digress. They said that white gun-owning citizens who were loyal to the U.S. Constitution would have to defend themselves. These theories became very popular in groups like the Michigan Militia that appeared in the 1990s. Some whites were clearly racist and opposed to the changes of the 1960s, but others were experiencing increased oppression and exploitation as poor and working class people and were angry about it. Just as black people in the 1960s blamed Jews for their oppression, poor white people in the 1990s blamed people of color and the Illuminati for their situation. In both cases, the analysis of these groups was incorrect, and it led them to fight the wrong enemy, instead of building solidarity with other poor and oppressed people. Despite their conservative flavor, these new Illuminati theories became popular in the hood. They spread through self-published books, and with the growth of the internet, through websites and videos. From the 1980s through the 2000s, Illuminati theory broke out of its traditional audience. Instead of appealing to elites threatened by mass movements, Illuminati theory now appealed to the black poor and working class and others in the hood. People in the hood started to talk about the Illuminati, the Bilderbergs, the Antichrist, and more. It may seem strange that the same theory would appeal to both white ultra-conservatives and poor black people. But really, this strange bedfellows situation has a long history. At multiple points in history, white supremacist and black nationalist movements have linked up. In the 1920s, Marcus Garvey met with members of the Ku Klux Klan to discuss how to separate whites and blacks through Garvey's Back to Africa scheme. In the 1960s, the Nation of Islam held similar talks with the Klan. In South Africa in the 1980s, during the collapse of apartheid, Zulu nationalists met with the white supremacist AWB group to discuss how to split the country into separate white and black nations. The overlap between these movements is based on their shared populist logic. Both white supremacists and black nationalists believe whites are fundamentally different from blacks. Both believe that they need to separate from each other given certain conditions. White supremacists think if they can't dominate blacks, they might as well ship them back to Africa. Black nationalists think if white people won't accept them, they might as well form their own separate nation. Illuminati theory is just one more example of this strange overlap. In Illuminati theories, poor people in the hood see banks and the political elite as their enemy, and they tend to embrace black businesses as a way to uplift the community, just like the Black Power movement of the 1960s. White conservatives use Illuminati theory to target the same enemies, as well as people of color, and embrace the U.S. Constitution as a way to unite with white political and economic elites. You can see this trend in conspiracy shows like Alex Jones' InfoWars. Illuminati theory presents the same danger as white supremacist and black nationalist theories. It will tend to support populist movements that unite poor white people and poor black people with their respective ruling elites instead of building a movement for the destruction of white supremacy and the liberation of all poor and working people. Illuminati theory also presents a second danger. It simply fails to provide an accurate explanation of oppression and resistance. End of section 2, beginning section 3, why Illuminati theory doesn't work. There are several logical shortcomings to Illuminati theory. Here are 6 main reasons why Illuminati theory isn't a useful explanation of the world. 1. Illuminati theory sees everything as connected and leaves no room for coincidences or mistakes. Illuminati theorists tie every major world event to the Illuminati. They believe every event in human history is carefully watched, planned, or even controlled by conspiratorial groups. They leave no room for coincidence. Illuminati theorists believe everything happens for a reason, that everything is willed. This view of history ignores that a gap always exists between what individuals or groups try to do and what ends up happening. This gap is a fact. It exists for the rich and powerful just like everyone else. Even the U.S. government, the most powerful government in the world, cannot stop dozens of major events every year, from natural disasters to bureaucratic screw-ups. Of course, some great world events were led by important individuals or groups. There were the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution and the Black Panther Party in the Black Liberation Movement. But serious study shows that none of these groups had an all-powerful controlling influence. There are always contingencies, coincidences, chance events, and mistakes. 2. Illuminati theory makes the enemy out to be all-powerful. Because Illuminati theory denies that history involves chance and mistakes, it makes the Illuminati seem godlike. This is when peasants used to say that kings were untouchable gods and couldn't be overthrown. The truth is there's no social group so powerful that humanity cannot overthrow it. I really like that. I'm going to read that again. The truth is there is no social group so powerful that humanity cannot overthrow it. When the French Revolution came, the king and queen were beheaded. In every period in history, myths arise that make the rulers seem invincible. With every transition to a new period, these myths are always shattered. 3. Illuminati theory fails to make basic logical or scientific arguments. When people talk about Illuminati theories, they vaguely suggest that there's a connection between groups and events, rather than demonstrating exactly how they are connected. For example, an Illuminati theorist might say, quote, "An earthquake happened the same day Obama made a speech using earthquake metaphors. This was not a coincidence," unquote. The Illuminati theorist hints that there is a connection, but doesn't say what it is. Did Obama cause the earthquake? Was he trying to drop hints about who caused it? They leave it up to your imagination. This lets the Illuminati theorist avoid having to demonstrate and prove the connection he or she is hinting at. Most of the time, if the connection were described openly, it would seem silly or implausible. Other Illuminati theories offer explanations of events, but then leap to saying their explanation is absolutely accurate. But just because an explanation for something is possible doesn't mean it's probable. If your car overheats and you explain it by saying a bird built a nest in your radiator, your explanation could be accurate, but that doesn't mean it's the most likely explanation. For your theory to become generally accepted, you would have to show that other competing theories are less likely, or prove your theory true in practice by opening up your radiator. Illuminati theory never does these things because it says we can never get hard evidence of the actions of such a secret group. In reality, there is plenty of evidence of what the capitalist class does on a daily basis. Most capitalist plans for economic and foreign policy are printed openly in the pages of The Economist and the Wall Street Journal. We can see them disagreeing publicly, and we can see that sometimes their plans don't work out. Sure, there are some secrets, but as WikiLeaks and Ed Snowden show, even these can be exposed by courageous people willing to take action. And most of their secrets are actually open secrets. Information is available in public libraries and websites, but people are often so overwhelmed by the volume of information available that we don't have time or energy to sort out what's important. Quick comment there. WikiLeaks is a huge effort, and I think that that's not a minor point. Setting up the infrastructure for people to do those leaks is kind of a big deal. Well, yes, there's a lot of information hiding in plain sight. Just because of the volume of information, you would never know. You'd never have time to just comb through everything. And so, there's tons of egregious stuff just right out in the open, but just nobody ever looks at it because there's a million things you could look at. There's a ton of stuff that is classified as well. So I think, sure, there are some secrets is a little bit of an understatement. Still, I agree with the general point that they put out here. Point 4. Illuminati theory is impossible to disprove. Illuminati theorists have a clever way of attacking anyone who argues against them. They say, quote, "That's just what they want you to think." Of course, Illuminati theorists never ask how they've avoided being tricked themselves. This argument is a trap because it never considers any evidence trustworthy. See a lot of this in the pandemic right now. And so it doesn't allow you to weigh the accuracy or usefulness of any theory. For example, how do we know that all the conspiracy theories on YouTube aren't actually produced by the Illuminati? How do we know that Illuminati theory itself isn't a government hoax designed to convince people that it's impossible to fight back? Or that Behold a Pale Horse isn't an Illuminati hoax, and the Illuminati is actually laughing at all the people who believe it? The logical traps are endless. Once you go down this road, you throw out any effort to really understand the world, or to weigh theories and evidence about how it works. Quick comment there. 2 words: flat earth. Flat earth. You want to talk about people not considering any evidence trustworthy? Just take a look at that. It's ridiculous garbage. Point 5. Illuminati theory leads to elitism. Most Illuminati theorists claim to want democracy and transparency, but there is nothing in their theory or behavior that shows that they're serious about either. Like the people who invented Illuminati theory in the early 1800s, Illuminati theorists today believe that the majority of society are blind sheep, or sheeple, who are incapable of doing anything without being controlled by an elite. When the public doesn't react to their theories by rising up in a rebellion, they blame the public for being stupid instead of examining their own theories. Very often, Illuminati theorists think of themselves as the only enlightened people and think everyone else is below them. Many Illuminati theorists are just as elitist as the groups they constantly theorize about, i.e., a lot of projection going on. Point 6. Illuminati theory offers no viable solutions to the problems it tries to explain. Ultimately, Illuminati theorists have no strategy, no game plan, no way out for billions of oppressed people on this planet. If the enemy is all-powerful, and most people are duped, then there's nothing that can be done. All they can do is constantly talk about conspiracies and complain that people are brainwashed and will never wake up. For example, look at the revolutionary strategy offered by Illuminati, the cult that hijacked the world, by Henry Makow. In the conclusion to this book, Makow offers tips for how to survive the New World Order. He tells us to, quote, direct our sex drive by confining it to a monogamous relationship, unquote. What does this have to do with fighting oppression and exploitation? He tells us to, quote, escape the money compulsion by living within our means, unquote. Should we just accept the poverty that's imposed on us? He defends us to, quote, defend your own soul by engaging in spiritual walks and meditation outside of institutional religion. These things are great to do, but they're not going to end police brutality, poverty, or environmental collapse. Marianne Williamson. And he tells us to, quote, ignore the crowd, which is manipulated by the Illuminati. So, don't sleep around, be frugal, pray alone, and ignore everyone. This strategy will never build a mass movement to change anything. The logical shortcomings of Illuminati theory are very convenient for many of its theorists. When it comes to fighting oppression, they can talk about it, but they don't have to be about it. What would these conspiracy theorists have said to U.S. slaves 150 years ago? That the white slave master was all-powerful? That he had duped the slaves into submission? That the slaves should stop having sex, be frugal, pray, and ignore the other slaves? They would have been the most conservative and cowardly people. That is what many Illuminati theorists are today, sad as it is to say. When Illuminati theorists do take action, they often end up becoming violent, lone wolf types like Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. They think the enemy is super powerful, and so extreme measures are needed. Comment, we would call this adventurism. This is constantly recommended against in Marxist-Leninist literature. But they also think the masses of people are stupid, and so the, quote, enlightened person can only act alone. This strategy never inspires masses of people. The lone wolf is not something most people look up to or imitate, even if they sympathize with his or her motivations. Ultimately, lone wolf actions are like cries of impotence. Quick comment there. Actually, there is some research showing that mass shootings and things like that, like acts of terrorism, can be somewhat contagious, but like not in a good way. They become a sort of like socially known way of expressing a certain feeling that becomes part of the cultural vocabulary. It's like there's, what do they call it, suicide contagions, I think. I forget the exact term. But basically that, you know, people who witness traumas like this sometimes do wind up imitating them. Although, again, where Timothy McVeigh was coming from in terms of like Aryan Nation indoctrination, things like the Turner Diaries, very, very different from what we would promote as Marxists. I want to add something to this too. It occurred to me years ago that the logical outcome of all of these kind of populist theories, where it's like, because you listen to the, these theories, and it's like, ultimately it all boils down to who's at the head of the pyramid. Is it the Illuminati? Is it the Freemasons? Is it the Jews? Is it the Catholics? like whatever. All targets of the KKK, like all of the conservative targets, that's another clue as to like where these theories are coming from. That they're basically conservative and that people interested in socialism should have really nothing to do with them. So ultimately, the logical conclusion of all this is exactly what the Nazis did. Is like, well, you identify the person or like group that's responsible for it all, and then like round them up and put them into death camps. Like that is basically where the logic of all this is heading towards, because they don't believe in mass movements. So anyway, I think that even in the socialist movement, there's too much of this thinking, particularly in the US, which is, I was talking in the last audiobook about anarchism and how Lenin says that anarchism is, speaking of lone wolves, is a ideology of despair. And talking about how I think if there's anything that characterizes the US working class, and I'm not necessarily blaming people, but I mean, just a fact, the fear, terror, and despair of the US working class. Like people want things to be different, but don't believe it's possible. And I think you see many different manifestations of that. Like the authors of this document say, cries of impotence. I think in many ways, the subscribing to anarchism, in many ways, it is like a cry of impotence. We need to believe in mass movements. And yeah, it's frustrating. And like, yes, US socialism doesn't have the greatest recent history. I think one of our biggest problems, we're constantly being co-opted by liberals. It's like a huge problem that people need to become immune to somehow. Like, just don't believe them. They're like, oh yeah, we'll take up your cause. No, they won't. They're going to take it up and bury it. Anyway, these are things I think we all need to look inward and think about. Continuing, the truth is, masses of ordinary people do have the ability to change society. History has shown it over and over again. Illuminati theorists are searching for answers about why society is fucked up. If masses of people aren't asking the same question, it's not because they're stupid, it's because they don't think it's possible to change things, and so they don't bother looking any deeper. Like, why would you want to know more about it if you can't change it? You just want to like keep your head down and live your life, becomes the thinking. Theories only move people to action when they provide an accurate explanation of the things they're experiencing and offer viable ways for them to act to change things. Illuminati theory offers neither. Illuminati theory is inherently elitist, conservative, inaccurate, and illogical. Ultimately, it is unable to explain oppression and exploitation, or help us figure out how to stop it. To truly stop oppression and exploitation, we need an accurate analysis of where they came from. That's the end of section 3, beginning section 4, where oppression and exploitation come from. The best way to explain oppression and exploitation is through a theory of the capitalist system as a whole, not Illuminati theory. A theory of capitalism explains how oppression and exploitation happen due to the everyday functioning of the whole social system. The activities and interactions of millions of people keep society running day after day. Comment, we see right now this labor shortage, the great resignation. Businesses are grinding to a halt. These people are just refusing to take these shitty jobs. It's society keeps going off of our backs. When we stop working, profits stop. This is our world, and we need to realize how much power we have in it. The activities and interactions of millions of people also create oppression and exploitation in the process. By explaining how this system works, we can figure out how to stop it and create something new. We can also see how Illuminati theory fails to recognize how our capitalist social system works, and instead blames the bad shit we experience on a single group of people like Masons, Jews, or bankers. In our social system, the vast majority of people experience alienation. Alienation means the act of separating something from yourself. When you go to work for a boss, you alienate your abilities to that person for the length of your shift. Your ability to lift boxes, do mental math, or coordinate an office are all properties of your body and mind, but for a few hours, they become a tool of someone else, who orders them around for their benefit. Your qualities are alienated from you to serve someone else. This relationship may seem simple, but it has huge consequences when it happens to millions of people every day. In our capitalist society, people are divided up into two main classes. The vast majority alienate their labor, their time, their whole lives in order to get a wage and survive. This class is called the proletariat. The proletariat includes the workers who have to alienate their labor and everyone who depends on them: unemployed people, children, the disabled, and more. A different class takes control over the alienated skills of the workers and the alienated products they make. This class is called the bourgeoisie, or the capitalist class. The bourgeoisie uses the skills and products of workers to their own benefit, ultimately in order to keep both classes in their respective positions. As long as these class relations of exploitation keep running day after day, the bourgeoisie will keep gaining more wealth and power by using the alienated labor of the proletariat and keep strengthening the system that keeps this relationship in place. To end this situation, we will have to do more than attack individual members of the bourgeoisie, like the Rothschilds or the Bilderbergs. We will have to attack the system of capitalist social relations as a whole. Alienation, our labor taken from us. Capitalism is a society built on alienated labor. At work, we put our skills to work for someone else. We manufacture products on assembly lines, but when they come out of the factory, they don't belong to us. We transport stacks of goods in trucks and warehouses that don't belong to us. We prepare and sell products that aren't ours in restaurants and retail shops. Even when we're unemployed, we're surrounded by buildings, clothes, and food that don't belong to us, which were alienated from people just like us when they were made. We struggle to survive because we can't take food, clothing, and shelter if we need them, or share them if we make them. Everything belongs to somebody else, usually to a corporation. Capitalism is a society divided into one class of people who control others' labor in order to make a profit, and another class, most of us, who can only sell our ability to work in order to get food, clothing, and shelter. A byproduct of all this alienation is that relations between people become hidden behind our relations with things. Everything in your apartment was manufactured, transported, assembled, and sold by other people living a lot like you, your fellow proletarians. Those people rely on the things you make, transport, or sell with your alienated labor too. But under capitalism, we don't provide each other the things we make directly. Everything we make, or transport, assemble, cook, etc., is given to a corporation, which ultimately sells it back to other alienated workers like us. Instead of relating to other people by freely sharing the fruits of our labor, we relate to things we have to buy and don't see the working people behind them. We become alienated from each other, too. Comment: this concept is called commodity fetishism, when we're relating to the things instead of the people who made them, and the people who made them become invisible to us. Reification, our labor turned into a thing. After a while, we come to view this situation as normal. We come to think of ourselves as isolated individuals. Soon it starts to seem like products impose their conditions on us. We are forced to go to work because otherwise we can't get things like food, clothing, and shelter. We are forced to choose careers, homes, and even spouses based on their dollar values. We aren't forced to do these things at gunpoint, but our options are limited because we don't have free access to the resources, land, tools, and skills necessary to sustain ourselves. These things were stolen from our ancestors, and today, if we don't work, we starve. If we don't make smart economic decisions, we end up poor. We end up justifying these relationships as natural and justified when they aren't. The stuff made by millions of alienated workers appears to dominate over the workers themselves. This process is called reification. Reification happens when a relation between people starts to seem like a separate force, imposing itself on the people taking part in the relation in the first place. We've all experienced reification at some point. When we've bowed down to our boss so often that all bosses seem to have some innate authority, that's reification. When we've been stuck in an unhealthy relationship for so long that the relationship, capitalized, shapes all of our choices, that's reification. The side effects of alienation don't stop with reification. In capitalist society, the process of alienation also gives rise to ever greater oppression. Every time workers manufacture something, transport, and sell it, they make money for the bosses. The workers who do the alienated labor along the way get a fraction of the money back in the form of a paycheck. But the vast majority of the money goes to the bosses, who then use it to hire more workers, to manufacture, transport, and sell more products, to make more money, and so on. Money that is used to make more money is called capital. Capital is our everyday labor alienated from us and reified into a thing that dominates us. Capital, our labor turned against us. The more alienated labor we perform, the more capital we generate. And the more capital is produced, the more power the people who wield capital have to dominate us. Capital takes different forms. Sometimes bosses invest in big office towers and factories, and capital takes the form of physical buildings. Sometimes bosses use their capital to hire people to make sure the process of making capital continues smoothly, for example, managers or cops. In this case, capital is personified in other human beings and human behaviors, but capital itself is bigger than any individual cop, manager, or boss. A corporation can change its CEO or board of directors, or reshuffle its entire workforce, and the capital flowing through it can continue to grow. Individual corporations can merge with each other or go out of business, and capital on a national scale will continue growing. It's like the Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy says, "Rulers are like bullets in a clip. As soon as you shoot one, another pops up to take its place." Capital is not just the capitalists who run the corporations. It's the whole system, the game with its own rules that everyone has to follow. So long as labor is alienated from one class to another, the day-to-day operation of society creates capital, and with it, a ruling class that takes control of alienated labor and products. Capital only grows by sucking our labor, which it can do in many ways. It can push us to work harder and faster. It can force us to work longer hours or accept lower wages and benefits. Capital is nothing but our zombified labor, half living and half dead. It is nothing but our bodies and minds turned into objects for use. We produce and reproduce the capitalist system every day. Television and toxic waste, pornography and plantations, silicon and slums, nurseries and nukes are all things it creates and recreates through our daily activity. Capital lives off our energy. It is vampire-like, parasitic, an alien force that dominates us from inside of ourselves. It reproduces itself through us, turning our creative powers against us, using our own bodies against ourselves. Capital is not a conspiracy of aliens. It's an alien we create. It's not just Jay-Z or George W. Bush. We have all sold our souls and our bodies to the devil. But it is a devil we create with our own hands. It can do nothing without us. Our bodies are its arms, its legs, its reproductive organs, and its brains. Therefore, we have the power to end it. Throughout history, poor and working people have struggled to limit how much labor capital sucks from them. They've tried to change the rules of the game or to stop playing it altogether. There's no way out but to destroy the system. Many people think that they can escape the cycle of alienation, reification, exploitation, and oppression without overthrowing the system. Like, quote, enlightened Illuminati theorists, they think they can find an individual way out, apart from everyone else, but it never works. We can try to hustle on our own, but we end up working just as hard for a boss, and we risk getting locked up. Whether we sell weed or bottled water, we still have to compete with other hustlers, or make money for the suppliers above us. We can start our own business, but we still have to overwork ourselves to compete with other businesses. We can try to get signed to a record label, but we still make more profits for our bosses than for ourselves. Even when we work, quote, for ourselves, our labor is alienated. We're still wasting our talent, creativity, and time in order to survive and keeping the system running. Sure, 1 in a million may become the next Jay-Z, who runs their own company, but this is only possible by exploiting thousands of other people who want to be Jay-Z too, and making sure they don't make it. All these strategies are failed routes out of exploitation and oppression. the only real way out is to overthrow the system. This is possible because we create capital, the very force that dominates us. But Illuminati theory doesn't recognize this fact. Instead of viewing the system of capitalist social relations as the enemy, Illuminati takes aim at particular groups of people. And that's the end of section 4, now beginning section 5, where Illuminati theorists think oppression and exploitation come from. Capitalism is an elusive process. It exists in the billions of social relations between workers and capitalists, and in millions of physical objects, but it can't be pinpointed in any one of them. It's a lot like gravity. Gravity can't be identified and touched, but it can be felt in the relation between planets. Similarly, you can't put your finger on capital in any one place, but it is present in the relations between people and asserts a powerful force on them. Illuminati theorists feel this force at work in society, but they identify it incorrectly. Illuminati theory mistakes bad people for capital. Illuminati theorists look around and accurately perceive aspects of the capitalist system, but their explanation is wrong. Instead of seeing capital as the dominating force in society, Illuminati theorists replace this with other forces using their imagination. Sometimes Illuminati theorists project the power of capital onto particular groups of people. As we've seen, capital isn't reducible to any one individual boss, manager, or cop. But Illuminati theory projects this huge power onto individuals, who come to be seen as having all the power of capital itself. Often, Illuminati theorists mistake real people who serve important roles in government or corporations for the force driving capitalism as a whole. They view rulers as evil individuals who control everything, instead of powerful figures who are still only players in the game, so-called. Illuminati theorists imagine that the evil rulers are secretly planning how to run the world. There is no doubt that many of the places important decisions happen, corporate boardrooms, the Federal Reserve, or the Pentagon, are not democratic and transparent institutions. Illuminati theorists are right to want everyone to have a say in the decisions that affect their lives, but they don't see that as long as the capitalist system is creating powerful people and corporations, democracy will never really exist. The vast majority of us can't participate in running society every day because we have to work for someone else to survive. Instead of running society ourselves, we vote someone else into power to do it for us. This won't end until capitalism ends. Illuminati theorists try to fight the enemies they imagine. They set out to battle the Illuminati, the Jews, the United Nations, or aliens. But all these are just individual personifications of capital, or a projection of capital onto made-up groups. People who try to change the world using Illuminati theory are boxing with shadows. The shadow is the shadow of capital, the real alien created by all of us, through the social relationships we participate in every day. Illuminati theorists blame a secret conspiracy that runs the world, when they should blame the system that recreates capital, power, exploitation, and oppression. Illuminati theory mistakes bad ideas for capital. Conspiracy theorists often emphasize how brainwashed people are. This shapes how they think liberation can be won, or if they think it's possible at all. We have a different take on people's ideas. We believe people develop new ideas through a complex process. Arguments, everyday experiences that clash with what we've been taught, and most importantly, learning through struggle, allow us to change our perspective. There's no doubt that the power of the media, Fox News or Glenn Beck, I guess that kind of dates this a little bit, doesn't it, are immense. But no one is ever a passive recipient of ideas. Take the example of rights. Our society teaches that everyone has equal rights. Everyone is smart enough to know it's a lie, but still, the idea seeps into their consciousness and becomes part of their common sense. This helps to uphold the system. But people can also use the same idea to challenge the system. They might demand rights that the system wants to deny them, like the civil rights movement in the 1950s. Sometimes, these struggles reach such a height that people question the idea of rights at all. This happened in the 1960s, when many people who had participated in the civil rights movement stopped thinking about winning rights from the government and started thinking about how to overthrow the government. As you can see from this example, the ideas people are brainwashed with, quote-unquote, do limit their thinking, but people aren't entirely passive. They also actively employ their ideas to understand their lives. and sometimes their experiences and struggle change their ideas altogether. Quick comment there, I cannot endorse this last point enough. Getting active in something, anything, starting a union at your workplace, starting a community campaign, whatever it is, even just going out and like putting up some signs in your community, like political signs or whatever. Doing all of this gives you tangible experience, which really helps to like move along your thought process. I know for me, times when I have gotten more active in real life, I mean, that's what I'm drawing on when I sat down to start doing this channel, is like, I wouldn't be doing this if I hadn't gotten involved in things in the past. So absolutely do that, because it really just shows you, like I said, it just advances your thinking significantly. Okay. According to most Illuminati theorists, people will only fight for liberation if their ideas change. The most effective way to change people's ideas, they say, is by talking to them or getting them to read or watch something that will enlighten them. These methods can make a difference on a small scale, but this doesn't happen so easily on a larger scale, involving thousands or millions of people. Yes, we have access to the internet, blogs, and YouTube, and this helps us reach more people, but a revolution is not going to be made one YouTube video at a time. Historically, people's ideas have changed in periods of immense crisis due to a variety of factors, and not just because they heard the correct argument and got the correct idea. Most importantly, they've changed as people have learned through the heat of struggle. People change through our experiences of struggle, not simply by listening to what others have to say. As more and more people start to fight, from Tahrir Square to Occupy to the Flatbush Rebellion, we begin to realize that we have collective strength that no one has dared to tell us about. Commenting, I would add there also the George Floyd protests or the street battles that have been going on for the last 5 years since that Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. People getting out in the street and just doing things makes you realize, oh hey, I can get out and just do things. It is that kind of process of self-discovery and collective discovery of exactly that collective strength that these authors just talked about. Like I said, there's nothing as powerful for advancing your thinking as getting out, getting hands-on, getting involved in things, because you realize at some point, oh, hey, I've been thinking about this for a long time. Now I'm acting, and it's happening, and the world is different because of it. It might only be different at a small level at first, but it is different because you're doing something that wouldn't be happening if you weren't doing it. And you start to realize that. You start to realize, like, oh, hey, I am more than just the ideas bouncing around in my skull. I'm not just some disembodied thoughts. I exist in the world and I can do things. Then we become open to new ideas when we weren't before. Consciousness is changed by great historical events such as World War I and II, the Vietnam War, the Russian Revolution of 1917, the economic crisis of 2008, or the murder of Trayvon Martin. Consciousness is changed when poor and working people struggle for their own freedom, and in the process clear their heads and develop new ideas. There's no magic trick to changing consciousness, no perfect conversation technique that will finally, quote, enlighten everyone at once. The study of how consciousness changes is ultimately the study of history, class struggle, and the ideas that are born in them. Only by ending the forms of oppression found in real life can we finally get rid of all the stories about aliens, the Illuminati, and other conspiracies. It is the exploitation we endure every day as workers and unemployed people that generates Illuminati theory. It is our alienation from each other and from our most fundamental human capacity to create food, clothing, shelter, art, cities, etc., which requires Illuminati theory as an explanation. To destroy this imaginary world of conspiracies, we must destroy the real world of capital. The only way to stop this oppression and exploitation is to attack the way society is organized and destroy the social relation between classes. To do this, we will have to abolish classes entirely. We will have to kick the bourgeoisie out of power and create a new society where labor isn't alienated, where workers control their work and where ordinary people control their own lives and communities. It's possible to do this because capital needs us. Human labor is required to keep the system going. Therefore, We have the power to end capitalism. But to do it, we'll have to do more than attack particular individuals who prop up the system. We'll have to attack the relations of exploitation and oppression that recreate capitalism. We'll have to attack the system of alienated labor and the existence of classes itself. The end of conspiracy theories will come with the end of capitalism. That's the end of Section 5. Beginning Section 6, Liberation Beyond Illuminati Theory. Capitalism isn't eternal, it wasn't decreed by God, and it isn't run by a secret Illuminati. Like any social system, it was created and it can be destroyed. As we've seen, capitalism depends upon our everyday activity to be sustained and reproduced. Therefore, we can destroy capitalism by organizing with each other to stop the process of exploitation and oppression, by defeating the forces that stand in our way, by creating new ways of running society, and living together with dignity, peace, and with all of our needs met. In a truly free society, everyone will labor for the common good, without being forced to work for a ruling class, or to pay for the goods produced by their fellow human beings. Throughout the history of capitalism, the struggle for this free society has been called anarchism or communism. Comment, here at Socialism for All, this is a socialist channel, and we're not real big on anarchism. We believe that many anarchists are good comrades, but that anarchism is an inferior ideology to communism or Marxism, so we don't really promote that. But yeah, many people are attracted to both of these for at least similar reasons. And moving on to the conclusion. In this pamphlet, we've traced the origin of Illuminati theory. It emerged in the early 1800s as a reaction to the revolutionary spirit of the Enlightenment. It was refined in the 1920s in reaction to another revolutionary wave that threatened capitalism itself. We've traced how these theories spread into poor black and brown communities after the 1970s, when the defeat of the black liberation movement left a political void in its wake. We've offered a critique of Illuminati theory. We've demonstrated that it leaves no room for chance or error, and so views the enemy as unbeatable. It relies on circular logic and innuendo rather than logical scientific argument. And it provides no clear strategy to end oppression and liberate humankind. We've offered an alternative explanation of capitalism, which also explains why Illuminati theory is so popular. Capitalism is an economic and social system where one class of people engages in alienated labor for the benefit of another. This everyday activity alienates us from each other, and it creates a reified power that seems to impose itself upon us. This power is called capital. It is bigger than any one individual or institution who wields it. It is regenerated every day by the activity of millions of people. Illuminati theorists sense this dynamic at work, but inaccurately project it onto individuals, groups, or made-up figures. We've argued that it's possible to overthrow capitalism and bring about a free communist society. Communism is possible because capitalism relies on workers, and must continually bring them together in cooperation in order to continue sucking their labor. This cooperation creates the possibility for revolutionary movements to change society. Communism is the movement of people to overthrow capitalism throughout history. It is also the organizations, experiences, and theory that have been developed out of all these historical experiences. We want to bring together talented thinkers and figures who yearn for liberation. We want to start a communist movement that eventually grows to every city in the U.S. If you agree with what we have written, let's sit down and figure out what we can do to end the oppression we see around us. And that's the end of the conclusion. There is a closing quote, "All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real condition of life and his relations with his kind." It's from the Communist Manifesto, 1848. So there's also a glossary at the end of this, as well as some suggested reading. I'm not going to read that into this audiobook, so basically that's the end of the audiobook, effectively. I'll provide a link if you want to check out the recommended reading list or the glossary at the back of the book. I did also omit one section near the end, which was on communism. And, we do enough on this channel, I think, talking about Marxism, Leninism, etc. And to be honest, the pamphlet kind of slanders the USSR a bit, as well as China. So, we're not going to get into that. There's like a little bit of like an anarcho-communist thing at the end. Uh, anyway, if you'd like to read that, you can read it from the link. But I've given most of my comments here. Like I said, I have definitely encountered this. I have attempted to participate in it. I'm glad that and really didn't get anywhere. Had to just completely abandon it. There's just really nothing you can do with this except to criticize it the way that the authors of this pamphlet did. So, except for that little quibble I have with the end, overall, I think that this is a pretty good. I've commented throughout about things that I would balance out a little bit if I were contributing to this thing. But overall, I think a nice head-on take, and I do really like how they take capital, and like this is the boogeyman that we're all actually trying to get at, whether it's the lizard people or whatever else. Like that is the thing we need to confront. I like how clear that point was, like how clearly it came across in this pamphlet. So what did you think? Leave a comment below. Keep the discussion going. Otherwise, thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month. Every donation is helpful as well as very encouraging. But whatever it is you are doing online and in real life to advance this discussion about capitalism and just get out there and do something, I appreciate it. I encourage you to do more, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks again.